is I'm going to just read you the opening passage of A Walk Through the Window for those of you who haven't heard it, and for those of you who have, you can remember the abject embarrassment that Darby is about to go through. Escape was clearly the only option. "This is the wrong address," Darby said to the cab driver. "Just take me back to the airport. I'll figure something out there." "I'm sorry, dear," the driver said apologetically, and gestured at the scrap of paper clipped to his dashboard. "I've been given strict instructions to drop one Miss D. Christopher at this here address. And if I know Ed, she'd be mighty upset with me if I misplaced her granddaughter." Great. Darby stared glumly out the window at the scene unfolding outside. "You know my Nan?" The cab driver popped the trunk and heaved himself out of the car. "Everybody knows your Nan, kiddo. She's a great sport. So is your grandpa." Darby didn't budge. From the cab window she watched as a woman with vivid red hair stepped up and placed her hand on the shoulder of some guy operating a ladder on the fire truck. Even from the inside of the cab, Darby could see the way the woman's lips pinched together. She was talking to ladder guy. After a few words, he nodded and yelled up at his partner. The bucket lowered with a jerk. The woman stepped inside and the contraption rose up near to the top of the tree. Bad enough to be stuck in some one lobster tank for the summer. Bad enough to have to fly here as an unaccompanied minor in a cattle car disguised as an airplane. Bad enough that no one bothered to show up to meet the plane. But when the taxi pulled up in front of Darby's grandparents' house, it was hard to decide which was worse. A man she had never met perched high in the branches of an old oak tree, or the crowd below, as they laughed aloud, chatted, and cheered on the fireman in his cherry picker, trying to talk the old coot down. Darby recognized Gramps from a couple of old pictures that her dad had kept in a bottom drawer. She never met either of her grandparents in person, at least as long as she could remember. Nan had to be one of the gray-haired ladies waiting at the bottom of the ladder. She hadn't seen her face yet, mostly because Darby didn't want to meet anyone's eye. Why any of this was happening was a mystery. She could feel her face flaming. The cab driver opened the door and offered his hand to help Darby out. She ignored it, grabbed her backpack, and stepped out onto the street. It must have rained earlier, and one of her new white runners splashed square into a rusty puddle by the curb. "Great. Was trying to help you avoid that," muttered the driver as he rolled down around the back of the vehicle. Darby thought about getting mad at this, but the truth was the scene in the front yard had used up all her available emotions at the moment. She felt the cabbie's hand on her shoulder. "Your grandpa's just having everyone on, Missy. The man has a sense of humor as funny as a $3 bill." She shook off his hand and forced herself to look around at the crowd of people. The two gray-haired women stood out from the rest. While everyone else chatted and laughed, they stayed put right near the fire truck, watching the other lady take her trip up in the cherry picker. Darby took a deep breath, shouldered her pack, and headed over. At the treetop, the red-haired woman was having more luck than the ladder guy. She barely said 2 words before the old man was reaching his hand out to grasp the side of the bucket. He stepped smartly into the cherry picker just as if that had been his plan all along. Ladder guy steered the bucket down, and Darby's grandfather waved to the cheering crowd as they descended. The shadows began to lengthen, and people started to wander away. One of the old women on the ground embraced the red-haired woman as she stepped out of the cherry picker, so Darby headed for the other one. "Excuse me," she said, but the woman did not appear to hear. Darby repeated herself a bit louder. The lady finally heard Darby and turned in surprise. "Goodness gracious," she said, peering up into her face. "This must be wee Darby." Since the girl was taller by about 3 inches, Darby felt she could have safely dropped the wee part. Sheesh. The lady looked over at the cab. The taxi driver had walked over to shake hands with the crazy old man, and both of them were laughing uproariously. "We've been expecting you, dear," she said, and immediately began rummaging in the giant vinyl bag that dangled from her arm. "Ernie will need his fare. Let me just look after it now that all the excitement is over." She scurried across and thrust some money at the driver, who doffed his hat. "Thank you kindly, Helen. That'll do nicely." Darby could hear his radio crackle from the depths of his car. He gave a final slap on the shoulder to the star of the show and slammed himself back into the cab before slowly coasting off down the street. The old lady scurried across the grass and gave Darby another thorough looking over before clutching her by the arm. Her eyes narrowed and her mouth tightened a little. "Quite an arrival time you've chosen," she said. "Hasn't been this much excitement since someone tried to blow up the legislature a few years ago." Great. Nothing like a grandparent whose antics compare to a terrorist act. Still, clutching Darby's arm, she turned to holler across the lawn. "Look what I've got here, Etta," she crowed. The red-haired woman snapped her head around. As soon as Darby saw the red-haired woman's face up close, she knew. She looked just like Darby's dad, except shorter, wrinklier, and female, of course. "Helen," she said to the lady who was still gripping Darby like a prize tuna, Did you pay Ernie for his drive from the airport? Great, thought Darby. We haven't even met yet, and I'm already a financial burden. There's no need for that, I'm sure, she said when Helen bobbed her head. Now take this, and thank you for your kindness. She pressed money into Helen's palm and turned to face Darby, taking the girl's shoulders in her hands and gazing at her from arm's length. So, this is the Darby girl at last, she said. For the first time, a smile broke through the worry on her face. I meant to meet you at the airport, but as you can see, my plans changed a little. She brushed her hands off briskly. Excitement's all over, my dear. Let's get inside and settled, shall we? But Darby looked over at the old man, still beaming and shaking hands with well-wishers. Never mind your grandfather right now, love. I'll see to him presently. Nan bustled off, muttering something about dinner being charred beyond recognition. The fire truck honked once as it pulled away from the curb, and Darby reached down to grab her suitcase from where Ernie had left it on the front porch. The scent of dinner wafted in through a window. In spite of Nan's worry, nothing smelled burned, and Darby didn't feel hungry in the slightest. As she straightened up with her suitcase, she found Gramps standing with a hand on the porch rail. He stopped laughing. Last saw you when you were 10 days old, he said. You've grown a bit. What else did he expect? Darby didn't know what to say, so she settled on saying nothing at all. Best come in for your supper. Don't want to keep your Nan waiting, he said at last. Some fools held her up enough already. He gestured at the retreating lights of the fire truck. Those boys better sharpen their eyes if they're looking for a blaze. No fire around here as far as I can see. He stumped up the 2 steps to the front door, and Darby watched it slam behind him, right in her face. Welcome to Charlottetown, she muttered, and wrestled her bags inside. So, this is how Darby comes to the little town of Charlottetown. Now, those of you who have read this story know that what's Darby's favorite thing to do? She's a skateboarder. She is a skateboarder extraordinaire, and she likes to think of herself as like the coolest skateboarding kid she knows. She's actually just pretty much a beginner in this story. By the time she gets to facing fire, she gets a little bit better at it. What she wants to do is she wants to spend the summer skateboarding down Yonge Street, right down to the CN Tower, right at the base of Yonge Street. And instead, she gets stuck with her weird grandparents in this little town called Charlottetown, PEI, and she feels like everybody there talks funny and is over 90. Well, of course, she's wrong on all fronts, but she doesn't know that. It takes her a little while to be there until she realizes that things maybe aren't as bad as she thought. So she meets this kid whose name is Gabe, and Gabe lives at the end of the street. He lives in an old sort of a blue house, and behind his house, there's an old outbuilding. And it used to, maybe when it was first built, I think it probably used to be a little old stone chapel. But since then, the roof's fallen in, and somebody's used it for a chicken house, so it's kind of not in very good shape. But it does have an old stone window frame that is still intact. And one day, Darby and Gabe shelter from the storm inside that stone window frame. And in fact, that is the first time they step back in time. Now, when I started writing this story, I really liked the idea that I could take a kid who is a normal 21st century teenager. Darby's 13 years old. And I wanted to give her a chance to go back and see what life was like for the people who had to make the decision to come to Canada. So that's what this whole series is based around. It's based around the idea that every single person in this room, whether it was you or whether it was your grandfather or whether it was your 6 times great-grandfather, came to this country as an immigrant at one time. So in this story, the very first story, time travel story Darby goes through is she goes back and she actually gets to see the very first peoples coming to North America. So in order to do this, to write this story, I had to do a lot of research, and then I had to do a lot of guessing, because the first people came to North America 10,000 years ago. How many of you have read a 10,000-year-old book? Well, what about on the internet? There's got to be a file somewhere with all the information of what happened then. 10,000 years ago? Come on. Well, of course, it's prehistory. This occurred in a time before people were writing things down. So what I did was I did the research. I studied a lot of what life was like in the north. I looked at the First Nations people who live there today, and the First Nations people who lived there in the past couple of centuries, and the history that they can find of the First Nations that came before them. And I used a combination of the languages that I found from all these different cultures, and I created a people who called themselves the People. And the People made their way across the Bering Land Bridge. Now, 10,000 years ago was the Little Ice Age. This was the last ice age that the Earth has gone through, and it wasn't even a regular ice age. It was just known as the Little Ice Age. The oceans froze up. So the Pacific Ocean froze up, the Atlantic Ocean froze up, almost down as far as the equator, certainly down as far as the tropics. And so because the oceans froze up, the Earth's temperature dropped so low, what that meant was that the water in the oceans drew back into giant, giant sheets of ice, huge glaciers, but it pulled away between North America and Asia. And there's a little land bridge that actually today is underwater, but during the Little Ice Age was exposed, a little land bridge between the very, very tip of Siberia in the Soviet Union, in Russia, oh, I'm dating myself here, in Russia, and the very, very top, westernmost part of Alaska. And this Bering Land Bridge, some people, some scientists believe that this is the way the entire continents of North America, Central America, and South America were populated, through a population that traveled across that land bridge. Now there's also speculation that some of the transportation was by sea, but in those days, 10,000 years ago, this was the approved method. So that was the first story, and in this first vignette, when Darby goes back in time, she gets to meet herself a polar bear. You guys read that scene yet? You want to hear it? Okay.